Hi everyone, it's Dr. Loyola here, welcoming you to our augmented reality unit. So this is just a quick video introducing you to our augmented reality unit. I don't really have much to cover, but I'm just going to go over some things about augmented reality narrative, some things to keep in mind in terms of the designing for augmented reality, and then of course a little bit about the prototypes that you'll be producing at the end of this unit. And I'll also talk a little bit about placing this augmented reality unit within the context of our class on interactive methods, interactive fictions, interactive narratives, and so on. And don't worry, I'm not going to do the whole video with these face filters. I just don't really have the selfie and arm stamina for that. But at the same time, given the option to kind of play around, I couldn't really resist. Okay, so let's start with our first topic, which is what is AR and how does augmented reality work generally within a narrative space? So just to kind of start off with this, there's tons of augmented reality, of examples of augmented reality and augmented reality being used to promote a narrative all over our world right now. So for instance, we see it a lot in advertising and e-commerce sites for things like see this couch in your space, which you can do on Wayfair or Amazon. And these, of course, are things that kind of promote that narrative of like home design, interior design, and so on. We can look at something like Zara's Shop the Look AR things in stores where you can use that augmented reality to convince people to buy things, enhance that consumerism, that story that goes behind any kind of fashion decision. And of course, we haven't talked much about that, but these are just kind of quick notes of where this kind of, we can see this happening beyond just the class and beyond kind of fictional game design. But going into gaming, we of course have Pokemon Go or the Harry Potter Wizards Unite games, which are kind of create this or add this level of immersiveness to the gaming experience and to the fictional world by using a combination of geolocative triggers and augmented reality to bring elements of the game world kind of literally, at least visually, like right into your world, right? So you can see this Dementor kind of mapped into your space, or you can see this Pikachu in your yard or whatever the case may be. And then for homework, you all looked at a few different things. So first you had the Instagram filters, which of course are also on Snapchat, and in some ways I think a little bit more popular on Snapchat, though certainly that could be changing. I'm not on Snapchat, so I can't speak with any kind of expertise there. But if we look at an Instagram filter, right, this is kind of an interesting space of augmented reality. Because these, as you've all kind of explored, they effectively map something onto your face to make you look differently. And this is kind of an interesting narrative space because it's effectively taking advantage of this kind of like huge boom in personalized visual narrative that we see happening in social websites and social networking sites, and taking advantage of things like selfie culture and selfie narratives and so on. Since of course the effect of these things only works through the screen, right? But that's also how we engage in these social web narratives and this kind of like visual design that we see happening online, right? And the visual narrative that comes with the presentation of ourselves in an online space. And that's probably more than you've ever thought about, like what you do on Instagram or in any kind of social media space. I don't know that many of you, unless you kind of maintain a brand, I don't know that you come to that thinking of it as a form of narrative, but it absolutely is, right? And we haven't talked much about that, but this, again, it's just to kind of give you a sense of this wider definition for how we can think about narrative in the ways that augmented reality support that narrative. So also from homework, though, a little bit more directly related to this question of narrative, were the series of New York Times articles that you had a choice to read from. So these are clearly based in narrative, right? We're talking about journalism and journalistic storytelling, though we're not in the space of fiction, right? So here we're kind of, again, expanding that idea of narrative to make sure that we include non-fictional things. And as you probably saw with the range of options on the New York Times, these are often take the augmented reality features and use them to enhance education, helping to teach something, explain something, or help support some kind of argument. So when we look at something like the Olympians in augmented reality, we can use like Nathan Chen spinning in our living rooms to get a sense of like the physics, right, that goes behind figure skating tricks and behind that kind of athletic performance. In the similar vein, we can look at this virtual tour of the Notre Dame Cathedral, which on the one hand no longer exists because it, did go up in flames. So we can see a version of it that existed that no longer does, and we can get a sense of kind of how this fire happened, right? So ostensibly, this is with a couple of shared goals, right? So on the one hand, this helps preserve cultural heritage and history through digital technologies, right? Which is a common use of digital technology that we've talked about less in this class, but certainly in other classes, especially those of you that were in text methods with me or who are going to be in text methods with me. The whole kind of archive discussion is a version of this, right? So now we kind of see, instead of simply archiving texts with something like a rich markup, as we saw in text methods, this is now preserving cultural history in a visual, multi-dimensional way through augmented reality, right? So preserving cultural history of physical objects. Another thing behind the Notre Dame example is also that purpose of kind of clarifying how this happens, which on the one hand maybe helps avoid unnecessary blame, but also hopefully helps us learn from it so that we don't have this same kind of disaster take place at other cultural heritage sites, right? Because fires, as we know, are a hugely destructive force that can take out, entire histories in a single go. Okay, and then one final example that is in the video right before this one and was on our original syllabus, but unfortunately we've had to take it off. And that is Amaranth Borsuk's Between Page and Screen. So in this piece, we've kind of gone a bit deeper now into this narrative rabbit hole, and we're back in kind of a literary fictional space. So this one is a favorite work of mine, and it's a literary arts exploration of the technologies of reading and the ways that we engage with text. So in this short book that's only like 25 or 30 pages long, there's a set of letters between two characters, P and S, which of course are page and screen. And so this text basically explores metaphorically what happens in the space between these two characters, in between their communication and their correspondence, but also quite literally what happens between the page of the book, which holds the trigger, and the screen of the computer, where you see things playing out. So as you should have seen in the video, and again, if you haven't watched it, please watch it. The letters also are animated, so that augmented reality kind of adds a layer of movement, kinetics, and materiality to the words themselves and to the narrative. And so they're animated, they move in space, they can rearrange themselves to enact different parts of the narrative. And so it's really taking advantage of that space between the computer and the screen as the letters kind of showcase all the various things that they can do, right, in that kind of imaginary digital space. But at the same time, it's a distance that can't ever be bridged, right? So you can't ever get those letters out of that space between. They're always kind of in that limbo between the page and the screen. And this is one that, again, as I said, it was on our original syllabus, because this really kind of brings us full circle in some ways to where we started this semester with thinking about postmodern literary experimentation as it finds its performance in digital interactive fictions, right? So we talked about things like the materiality of the text, and here you can see the text really having a material a sense of its materiality with being physical, like it falls from the screen, it moves around, it's multidimensional. We also see this one dealing with the reader's role in creating or supporting a narrative, right? Because the reader has to kind of perform the narrative through these QR codes into the computer's camera to get the augmented overlay. And then it also continues this kind of theme we've seen of challenging the linearity of text, right? Because this, even though it's a book that we perhaps read sequentially from page to page, the text itself is no longer linear, right? It's spinning around, or it's in the shape of a pig, or it's doing, whatever else it's doing that's not staying in a line as it would be in a book, right? So these are all things that we saw back in the hypertext unit. that are now kind of getting re-performed and re-experienced in this augmented reality fictional space, right? So in each of these instances, and I know I've just given you like kind of a big laundry list of different AR instances from something like Amazon or Zara's, Instagram, New York Times, whatever. In each of these instances, we can get a strong sense, I hope, of what augmented reality is, right? And that is that it is superimposing or placing digital information or digital media like images, sounds, animations, texts, whatever, but something that's digital and superimposing it onto the real world, right, or into a non-digital space like a living room or a bedroom or a front yard or wherever. And as you can kind of see too, and hopefully you get a sense of this from the ones that you explored for homework, right? A lot of the uses and effects of this augmented reality narrative is about enhancing your experience, right? Creating an added sense of immersion or realness to fictional encounters, immersing you in a space or an object that you can't really be immersed in, like the Notre Dame Cathedral, for instance, or kind of really placing things in your space, right, in the sense of like buying a couch to ensure that it really can be immersed as part of your wider space, right? So we're kind of thinking now immersion on this wider scale, but still with thinking about how things operate in space, right? And one thing that we do want to make sure is clear is that it is important in an augmented reality that we have both presence of the non-digital and the digital together, right? So that you still have a strong sense of what the real world is, and you still remain immersed in and focused and locked into that real world, but there's like some added or augmented content, right? And we want to be clear about this distinction because that is what ultimately separates augmented reality from virtual reality, where in virtual reality, right, the whole point is to get rid of the real world and put you fully in another environment, right? Whereas augmented reality is kind of playing with that slippage in that space between, where the real world can be enhanced with digital content, but where you still kind of maintain your grasp of that space. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our kind of second big topic, which is how augmented reality works. And this is, again, not going to really be a technical overview. You have the Mashable video for that and the optional readings. But instead, this is what I want to kind of focus on instead is from that technical information, what that means in the examples that we've looked at, where we can see that technology being enacted, and then what that means for when you're going to design an augmented reality experience, what different things you need to consider to make the experience work, right, and to make the experience effective. So just as a quick review, augmented reality essentially works by having two different pieces of things interacting with one another, right? One of those things is a trigger, which is something that a computational device can read and understand. And that device can be your phone, maybe your computer, and that device must have a camera, right? So that camera is the second piece of this puzzle, right? So the camera that can actually read the trigger. So two things, a trigger and a camera that can read the trigger. So if we think about this in terms of the stuff that you've looked at for today, for Instagram filters, of course, the trigger is your face. So the computational camera on your phone has been taught to recognize what kinds of things make up a human face. So eyes, nose, mouth, bone structure, chins, foreheads, the curvature of a face, and so on. But importantly, it has been taught with enough specificity to not mistake something that's not a face for a face, we hope, but also with enough flexibility to recognize a range of faces and a range of face shapes. And then besides this trigger, of course, there's the front-facing camera on your phone, which is used to position yourself in the frame so that it can then find the trigger, which is your face, and map on those filter effects. And we can kind of see this with lots of different examples. For instance, here, the trigger and camera effectively map cat ears and whiskers and nose placed onto my face, but placed in the right places, right? In this example, we can see the eye triggers being used to help place sunglasses. But here, this is my daughter, so you can kind of see where obviously her face is shaped much differently than mine, and it still works, right? And then there's something like this one, which is actually one of my favorites, where it maps onto both face and skin color to make it look like that particular part of my body is disintegrating into nothing, right? But again, this is a great example of focusing on just the face, because it's only my face that disappears, right? My upper body, my shoulders, and everything else completely are still there, right? So this is kind of showing that specificity of the trigger, that it can be localized just to that one space and not mistake other things. In the New York Times articles, for them, the trigger is this flat surface. And you probably saw while trying to enact the augmented reality experiences that it's the flat surface, and moving your phone around to enact things, and those little yellow dots, right, which is what the computer's using to map and understand the surface and then present the image, right? So this is one where you can actually kind of really see the limits of this kind of technology, right? Because you do have to move the camera around. Some surfaces aren't flat enough. Some of them can't really be picked up. If you tried something that was reflective, like a glass surface, it's not quite as effective as a matte surface. My carpet in certain spaces wasn't really good enough, so I had to go onto like a hard floor, right? And so things like that. But it does work, right? So using that trigger, we have something like this one, which is from an augmented reality article that was not part of your homework, but where you can see this sculpture by Kara Walker, which is part of A-Rod's personal collection, so it's not viewable in a museum. But with the augmented reality experience, you can get access to this art. You can walk around it, see multiple angles, right? Really kind of examine it for what it is. Right, and then we see that kind of similar process with something like the moon landing piece, where of course similarly we can't be on the moon in this past moment with these other astronauts, but it compiles the data of that trip to give us lots of different points of access to this moment in history, right? So proximity to the spacecraft, taking the panorama, what the view might have looked like for these astronauts, right, and so on. So kind of putting us right into that perspective through the augmented reality markers. And then for between page and screen, the trigger are these special QR codes, which are designed by the author, Amaranth Borsa, to be specific to this text, right? And these are very fancily called fiducial markers. And basically, it's the QR code that is readable by a computer, and then will allow it to present the AR content, right? So it acts as that trigger. And because of that trigger, we have something like this page, which is the PS or the postscript page, where we see these letters kind of falling from the sky and piling up. We have this page where the words are shaped like a pig, and that's talking about charcuteries. Or there's something like the animation of the letters as they kind of scatter out into the world when you turn the page, which of course is kind of a metaphorical representation of the ways that our communications can often feel when we don't get an immediate reply, right? So when writing a letter or sending a message, right, there's this kind of sense of just scattering language and words out into the void, and hopefully someone will kind of piece them together and respond. And then just as one more final example, since we did just finish the geolocation unit, if we look at something like Pokemon Go, this is of course working on a combination of triggers, which is first the geotag to lock the Pokemon to a certain location, and then that visual trigger to map the Pokemon visual onto that location, right, and actually make it show up in that space. So as I've mentioned, and as the resources on Moodle explain in more detail, I just want to kind of highlight this process to clarify the design process behind creating an AR experience, right? So we've got these two pieces, the trigger and the camera. So what does that mean that you need to think about as the designer for using these two things together, right, to create an effective experience? So first, and perhaps most obviously, is the trigger itself, right? You need to think as a designer of what are you going to use as your trigger. How will you focus the trigger sufficiently so that your camera can recognize it as a trigger, right, and can map the augmented content to it? Or if you're working for something that's going to be more publicly spread out, so something like the Instagram filter or a New York Times story, how are you going to balance the technology's need for precision, right, to understand the trigger, with the public's need for generalizability, right? So, or this flexibility so that a wide range of people can enjoy the experience, right? So what are you going to use for your trigger, and how are you going to design within what that trigger means in the real world and for your audiences? So second thing to think about is what's going to appear on the trigger, and is this going to make sense within the context of the trigger placement, right? So for instance, if we think about face filters on Instagram, those only really make sense within the context of your face and a selfie, right? In the same way, the kind of try this couch in your living room thing that Wayfair does, again, only makes sense within the context of buying furniture for your house. And then finally, Nathan Chen spinning on my dining room table, again, only makes sense within the context of this Olympic athlete story from the New York Times, right? So what I'm trying to highlight here is that in each of these cases, these AR triggers are placed within a wider contextual frame that makes them make sense, right? And that frame is created less by the augmented content itself and more by all of these surrounding texts, right? So Instagram as a social media space for sharing images and with a lot of selfie culture. Buying furniture as part of filling up your house and living in a space and making a space yours. Reading a story about Olympic athletes, right, on the New York Times. Each of these is what ultimately provides that contextual frame that makes the AR trigger and the AR content actually make sense, right, and actually kind of work as an overall narrative experience. So what this means then is that a big part of your design for augmented reality experiences is creating this broader narrative context outside of the augmented reality that can hold the augmented reality within it or frame it, right? So it's not enough just to make the trigger and the augmented reality content. You need to create that entire framing context for it to make sense within. Okay, so now we're going to move on to placing augmented reality as a unit in this class. So this is, as you all know, our fourth and final unit. And over the course of this semester, we've been focusing on methods for thinking about and designing for interactive, primarily fictional experiences, but somewhat more broadly as interactive narrative experiences. In the order of this work, this may not be evident to you, so I'm just going to walk you through it. The order of these things has been basically going from an intense control by the system to less control by the system and more freedom for the user. So we started with hypertexts as kind of our biggest controlling space, where as a user, you can only move by clicking on the selected options presented to you, right? And that's kind of the system is exerting a large amount of control on the user's interactions, right? We have a simple interaction of clicking, and that only takes us to one place, right? Though perhaps we have choices of where to click. And then we moved to parsers, where you are allowed to type anything you want, right? So that's a wide amount of freedom, but you still remain pretty constrained by what the system is going to understand. And of course, that focus on text. So in this case, we've moved slightly farther away from the control of the hypertext into a more flexible, more free-flowing space for the user of the parser. But again, that constraint of what will the machine understand. Then we moved to geolocation, where in this case, you are highly constrained by your ability to move through space. But beyond that, the constraints and the movements are pretty open. But again, right, that being constrained by your movements is very real, as we're kind of experiencing now. And then finally, we're now in the augmented reality unit, which has lots of freedom for the users, but is of course reliant on, in the first place, being able to find or access triggers that are going to make the AR work. So location triggers, face triggers, surface triggers, the special QR code triggers, right, for something like between page and screen. And then second, they're reliant on, of course, having the hardware that's going to be able to read the trigger and run the software to produce the augmented reality effect. So some of you might have noticed in the New York Times, this is a very kind of real thing that you kind of need to be running the most updated version of the OS software. You need to be running the most updated version of the New York Times app. And you might have even noticed that there's like an announcement that it now works on Android, which of course implies that it first came out for iOS, which is what happened, right? So that's kind of highlighting that that requirement of hardware and software to actually be able to run the trigger and recognize the trigger through your camera to create that augmented effect. And then, as I mentioned when I kind of opened this video, the other reason for this being our last unit is that it's really just fun, right? It's like a cool, sexy, fun thing to do to close out the semester. I don't have a lot of kind of critical apparatuses for thinking about it for you guys. This is much more of a let's just kind of see what you make of of your experiences with AR, of these narratives, and just kind of explore it, right? So in keeping with that spirit of like, this is kind of our fun way to close out a little bit more open-ended than some of the other things, I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about your prototypes, which is also going to be different from the others for a couple of reasons, both, of course, because we're now kind of online and asynchronous, and then also because there's kind of a range of ways that you can approach exploring augmented reality narratives. Okay, so within your prototypes, you will have, as I said, 3 options for how you want to explore this AR narrative design and AR technologies for this class. So option 1 is the most kind of techno heavy, and that is to try and create your own Instagram face filter using Spark AR. Spark AR is a free technology that you can download. It's supported by Facebook and really kind of made in a lot of ways to create more Instagram filters and, of course, get more traffic and people on that site. So as I said, this is kind of the toughest technology-wise, but there's tons of tutorial support out there, lots of assets, lots of languages that you can use, and so on for working with Spark. And because it's made to create Instagram filters, there's a lot of kind of support there. So if you choose this option, I want to be clear that you don't have any requirements to put it online and to make it live on Instagram. But if you wanted to, that would be pretty cool so that at least we can try it out. Option 2 is a little bit less tech heavy, or I guess maybe I'll say tech heavy in a different way, right? So option 2 is to take inspiration from Between Page and Screen and create your own Between Page and Screen ebook, or even physical book if you want to, and if you've got some paper crafting that you feel like doing, to print your own markers and write your own kind of AR text in the same model as that one. So this is one on the Between Page and Screen site. There's a full tutorial for how to print your markers, how to build a text this way, and how to bind your own little booklet if you wanted to. And this would be ideal if you're kind of interested in exploring ways to play with text in augmented reality, and ways to think about augmented reality presentation of animated text and text-based storytelling. If you choose this option, you will be required to write at least 5 pages of or five QR codes, right? So 5 pages of text or 5 pages in this book. And then finally, option 3 is to kind of think more expansively and more narratively and create a fully fledged paper prototype of a narrative with augmented reality triggers like the New York Times journalism pieces. So this would be one where if you're kind of thinking more on a narrative side and less interested maybe in the tech and more interested in kind of the pre-tech design. So think of a story that you could tell or a story you could adapt, and then map out how and where you might include augmented reality triggers, what kinds of content you would augment, why you would augment it, and so on. So if you choose this option, like the Between Page and Screen option, you will need to create at least 5 spaces for triggers with images, sounds, text, whatever you want, sketched or drawn in whatever program you want to use, to give a good sense of kind of how this would play out, right? So how this narrative would work, where the augmented reality would be, how it would enhance the narrative, and so on. This should, on some level, also kind of contain the like the richest narrative experience of all of the options. There will be a full assignment sheet and detailed kind of assignment video coming this weekend. As well, there will be 2 tool tutorials coming from your last peers that need to post those. So those will be up hopefully this coming Sunday to kind of get you started with this technology if you choose to do the tech option. that actually kind of closes out everything I have for you guys regarding augmented reality. It's really something that I think is, as I said, like fun, super sexy, kind of cool to play with. But we're very much kind of in a space of play at this stage, both because of the conditions of the class now and because of this unit, right? So I hope that you will kind of embrace that spirit of play, have some fun with it. And I really do look forward to seeing kind of what you make of these experiences and of the prototypes.